The Proclamation of London by Francis Barker Yockey. Introduction. The Proclamation of London, 1949. Throughout all Europe there is stirring today a great superpersonal idea, the idea of the Imperium of Europe, the permanent and perfect union of the peoples and nations of Europe. This idea embodies in itself the entire content of the future, for unless this idea is fulfilled, there will be no European future. Those who regard this idea which is expressed at this moment in the Liberation Front as a danger to them wish to destroy it at all costs. Its enemies are, first, the anti-European forces without the Western civilization who, at this moment of history, dominate the entire world, and second, their subservient lackeys within the Western civilization, the reactionary party politicians together with the self-interested forces they represent. Both are united in their blind hatred of this young and vital idea, which is irresistibly releasing forces which threaten to engulf these old powers of reaction, finance capitalism, class war, and Bolshevism. This is addressed to the entire Western civilization, to the colonies planted all over the world, and to the heart and soul of the West, the mother soil and father culture of Europe. It is Europe that is the focus of the historical force of the world. The profundity and strength of this soul and body dominate even those extra-European forces which have just concluded a temporarily victorious war against Europe, and who are now engaging in preparation for war against one another, in which each hopes to push its crude and formless lust for negative conquest even to the mastery of the world. In the plans of their masters of today, the true American people and the Russian people figure only as expendable material. In these two populations there are wide and deep strata which inwardly belong to the Western civilization, and who look to the sacred soil of Europe as to their origin, their inspiration, and their spiritual home. To these also this proclamation is addressed. By gigantic war, by terror, and by manifold persecution, the party politicians and their extra-European masters have sought and seek to stifle this mighty idea. They have sought in vain to deprive it of voice, and of all means of self-expression through the written word or the spoken. They themselves thus testify that the Liberation Front is already a power in Europe. Against the organic imperative of the front, they seek to enlist all the forces of the past. They create thus a spiritual disjunction which compels all men to take their place on the one side or the other. It has become necessary that those who are in the service of this idea should proclaim to the Western civilization the spiritual foundations and significance of the Liberation Front, and of the Imperium of Europe, for which the front will clear the way, for this front is the sole creative force of our times. Therefore, the representative adherents of the front from all the former nations of Europe have gathered together in London for the purpose of documenting their outlook, their aim, and their position in the world. This proclamation is published in the original in the German, English, Spanish, Italian, French, and Flemish languages. Section 1. The historical foundations of the Liberation Front. Number 1. The unity of the Western culture. From the beginning, the Western culture has been a spiritual unit. This basic, universally formative fact is in the sharpest contrast to the shallow and ignorant outlook of those who pretend that the unity of the West is a new idea, a technical thing which can only be brought about on a limited and conditional basis. From its very birthright in the Crusades, the Western culture had one state, with the emperor at its head, one church and religion, Gothic Christianity, with an authoritarian pope, one race, one nation, and one people, which felt itself and was recognized by all outer forces to be distinct and unitary. There was a universal style, Gothic, which inspired and informed all art from the crafts to the cathedrals. There was one ethical code for the culture-bearing stratum, Western chivalry, founded on a purely Western feeling of honor. There was a universal language, Latin, and a universal law, Roman law. Even in the very adoption of older, non-Western things, the West was unitary. It made such things into an expression of its proper soul, and it universalized them. More important than anything else, this culture felt itself to be a power unit as against all outer forces, whether barbarians like the Slavs, Turks, and Mongols, or civilized like the Moors, Jews, and Saracens. Embryonic national differences existed even then within the West, but these differences were not felt as contrasts, and could not possibly become at that time the focus of a struggle for power. A Western knight was fighting equally for his fatherland, whether in battle against the Slav or the Turk on the eastern marches of Germany, against the Moor in Spain, Italy, or Sicily, or against the Saracen in the Levant. The outer forces recognized as well this inner unity of the West. To Islam, all Westerners whatever were lumped together as Franks, Giaours. This higher cultural unity embraced within its rich possibilities the several nation ideas which were to actualize so much of Western history, for it is obviously a part of the divine plan that a high culture create as phases of its own unfolding not only higher aesthetic units, schools of music, painting, and lyric higher religious and philosophical units, schools of mysticism and theology, higher bodies of nature knowledge, schools of techniques and scientific research, but also higher power units within itself. Emperor versus papacy, states versus emperor and pope, front versus king, nation versus nation. In Gothic times, the intercultural power struggle between emperor and pope was always strictly subordinated by the universal conscience to the outer tension with the non-member of the culture, the barbarian and the heathen. The nations existed then, but not as power units, not as political organisms. The members of the nations felt themselves to be different from one another, but the differences were in no case determining of the whole orientation to life. A Slavic, Turkish, or Moorish attack on Europe was met by forces drawn from all parts of Europe. The first political expression of Europe was in the Crusades, in which Europe was a power unit acting against the outer world in unitary self-assertion of its newborn soul. Alongside of this form of politics there arose the tension which endured for 3 centuries within the culture of the twin factions of emperor and pope, and then from the middle of the 13th century began the revolt of the great barons and bishops against the absolute power of emperor and pope. This was a step further away from the prime cultural unity, but it in no way affected the great essential idea of unity of the West vis-a-vis any extra-cultural force. Thus, during this period the Pope decreed that the crossbow was a barbarous weapon, and forbade its use against members of Western Christendom, but expressly sanctioned its use against barbarians and heathens. The increasing political differentiation within the culture was simply the organic process of fulfilling the manifold possibilities of the soul of the Western culture. The entire process was organically necessary, and thus divinely necessary, for the soul of a high culture is a direct emanation of the Godhead. The development continued with the breaking of the religious unity of the West, in Renaissance, Reformation, and Counter-Reformation. These phenomena, religious in origin, show us the true meaning of the political. Whenever any superpersonal movement or idea rises to the intensity at which it involves the question of life or death, it therewith becomes political, regardless of its origin in a non-political sphere. From that moment, the contestants are states, political organisms, regardless of how they describe themselves, and the way of conducting the organism is the political way, dividing the world into friend and enemy, seeking after power and not after truth, pursuing alliance, war, and negotiation and not conversion and salvation. This is the lesson of the Reformation centuries, as it had been of the centuries of the papal imperial conflict. Accompanying the breakdown of religious unity, which transformed itself into a political struggle, was the rise of the dynastic state, and the beginning of large-scale intracultural wars among Western states. Again, the disunifying process within the culture was limited. The intra-European wars which took place were conditioned entirely by the great fact, felt and understood by all, that the European states belonged to the same cultural world. Thus, these wars never proceeded to the political annihilation of the opponent. They were prosecuted only to the point where the limited issue which had occasioned the war could become the object of negotiations which could satisfy both contestants. The handing over of a strip of territory or the recognition of an inheritance, such were the limited issues of these intracultural wars. The scale of these dynastic wars gradually increased, until the dynastic form of politics was itself finished towards the close of the 18th century, when a new form of intracultural power struggle emerged. But during the centuries of dynastic politics, with its limited wars and its conquest preservation of cultural unity, the other type of politics, with its other form of war, went on between Western political units and outer forces, absolute politics. These wars were unconditioned by the fact of mutual membership in a high culture, and the presence of a common code of honor, for the barbarian and the heathen did not share the feeling of Western chivalrous obligations. The Hussite Wars, 1420–1436, show the nature of warfare between a cultured people and a barbarian people. For 16 years, the Hussite army flooded over large areas of Germany, burning, ravaging, killing, and destroying. This nihilistic Slavic outburst was totally unconnected with any constructive war aim, and was thus merely an early expression of what is now called Bolshevism, the spirit of negation and destruction wherever it manifests itself, which aims at the outer annihilation of everything Western. During the centuries of Gothic and Baroque, it was primarily Germany and Spain which protected the body of the West and saved it from the barbarian horrors which had been its fate if the outer forces had prevailed. Number 2. The Age of Materialism. During the centuries of its growth and unfolding, the Western culture increased in power and maturity. The inner aspects of life steadily receded before the external aspects, until the end of the 18th century. The West stood before its deepest crisis up to that time. Since the issue was great, fundamental, and intense, it immediately became a matter of life and death. That is to say, political. The great crisis took political shape in the French Revolution. As ever, when an idea rises to political intensity, it absorbs everything else within it, and focuses all human attention and effort onto the power struggle. The revolution, however, was not French alone, but European. This total revolution marked the victory of democracy over aristocracy, parliamentarism over the state, mass over quality, reason over faith, equality ideals over organic hierarchy, of money over blood, of liberalism, pluralism, free capitalism, and criticism over the organic forces of tradition, state, and authority. In one word, of civilization over culture. Rationalism and materialism were the common denominators of all the new ideas which rose in revolt against the old order of thought, state, economy, society, war, and politics. Metaphysics was to be a matter of weighing and measuring. Government was to be a matter of counting noses. Economy was to be entirely reduced to money branding. The structure of society was to be a reflex of money. International relations of war and politics were to be the apotheosis of national egoism, with utter disregard of the great, inclusive cultural unity of which the nations are mere separate manifestations. Even today, after more than a century of undermining, the traditional connections of the culture-bearing stratum of Europe are unimpaired, and reach straight back to the self-evident pride and mastery of our Gothic youth. And this connection is not weaker, but stronger with time, for the direction of our spiritual development has changed, and a second great world transformation has occurred in the life of the West. We are now in the midst of the second great turning point of the maturity of culture. The noise and the shouting of democracy and materialism have died away. Liberalism has become a foul tyranny, masking an evil and anonymous dictature of money. The parliaments talk now only of themselves, and it no longer matters what they say. The critics have dissolved themselves in their own acid, and cannot believe now in either their methods or their results. Rapacious capitalism has eaten up its own foundations. Finance has converted the nations into huge spider webs of debt, via which all Western mankind is trapped. Above all, fanatical chauvinism has destroyed all the former fatherlands and delivered them to the occupation of extra-European forces of barbarism and culture distortion. All of this is the legacy of the age of materialism. The servants of that age continue to apply its outmoded and sterile methods to the living tasks of the present. But even as their dead and rigid hands grip the reins of power, the revolt continues. They cannot build a wall against destiny. They cannot order history and time to stop in their tracks. The assertion of liberal capitalistic democratic parliamentarism that it has a timeless and eternal right to rule is an organic lie. The methods of the materialistic age, its antiquated ideologies and cadaverous sterility cannot even survive except as an instrument of extra-European forces unfailing to the inner force of European destiny. Even as the cadaver of materialism tries to divert the lifeblood of the new and vital forces into its hardened arteries, it sinks deeper into the clammy rigidity of death. Against this corpse rises now the upthrust of the resurgence of authority, the highest embodiment of the old, eternally young and manly virtues of discipline, responsibility, duty, loyalty, and faith. In the face of the chaos of individualistic liberal capitalism, it flings its demand for a superpersonal ethical socialistic order. Over the equality ideals of democracy and the chaos of national and international pluralism rises now the imperative of hierarchy and imperium. Displacing suicidal petty statism is the idea of the monolithic culture state nation race people of Europe as the prelude to the greatest task of all, the expression of the absolute Western will to unlimited political imperialism. The ultimate outcome of this gigantic struggle is known to us, for we have seen before the struggle of the past to retard the future. From 1800 to 1850, the reactionary adherents of the negative alliance against democracy allied themselves with the ideas and methods of the past in order to prevent the future. But it was the Democrats of that time who represented the true idea of the times, and history does not go backward. The Holy Alliance had to fail, regardless of the material power at its disposal, for armies and cannon cannot fight against an idea. Within a mere century, the Democrats, equalitarians, liberals, critics, ideologues, and parliamentarians have become the most radical opponents of the spirit of the age, for this age is no longer that of money, democracy, and equality, but that of authority, discipline, and faith. No more than the liberal Democrats could be permanently suppressed in 1850 can they suppress us in 1950. Even as the liberal democratic tyrants bring their economic pressure, they have a bad conscience. They show it further in their vacillation between senseless cruelty and clumsy bribery, in their childish propaganda and their vain cajolery. But to the bearers of a superpersonal mission, no yielding is possible, either to terror or to compromise, for this mission emanates directly from the ultimate reality of God. To the materialistic liberal communist democrats, the inner enemy of Europe, we present only one unalterable demand: they must vanish from the face of history. Against this inner enemy and the spirit he embodies, we now document our charges before all Europe. In three realms, materialistic, communistic, liberal democracy has injured the body and thwarted the destiny of Europe. 1. Within the European nations. 2. In the relations among the nations of Europe. And 3. In the relations of Europe to the rest of Europe. Section 2. The chaos of the present. A. The undermining of the nations. Number 1. Class war. In its first phase, the great revolution of nationalism and materialism turned itself against the two poles of the cultural life, the forces of authority in the spiritual life and the political social life. Encyclopedism, Jacobism, Freemasonry, and Republicanism are some of its early forms. They fought all signs of rank, and against anything which had grown organically throughout the centuries. The spirit of this revolt permeated the ruling strata in some countries, particularly in France, and it was this weakness above that made the revolution and the terror of 1793 possible. The canine never breaks loose until the ruling elements permit it. This was equally true in 1789 as in 1944, with the American conquest of Europe. The worship of reason applied to state and society developed the test of quantity as the sole measure of legitimacy, not rank, talent, genius, or ability, but number alone mattered to the materialists. The source of power, according to the doctrinaire Democrats, was in the broadest, most undifferentiated mass of the population, and not in the spiritually differentiated strata born with the mission of accomplishing the life task of the nation and actualizing the national idea. Blindly, the democratic ideologues continued with their work of leveling and destroying. In the century 1850-1950, they actually succeeded in undermining the state and society. What succeeded the old order? Nothing that the Democrats of the early period had sought. The new center of gravity of life was in economics, and the dominating economic rivalry was between the industrial capitalist and the financier. All the idealism and all the sacrifice of the equalitarians had only succeeded in wiping out an organic aristocracy and substituting for it a sordid and vulgar plutocracy. Within all the countries there now began the next form of class war, the war between economic groups instead of between social groups. The differences engendered by quality and tradition had been undermined, and the economic materialism now supplied the cadre of forms of the struggle. By speculation and manipulations on the exchange, the finance capitalist attacked the productive forms of property so that they might all be working for him, the unseen and unknown master, controlling the economic life of continents through his universal network of debts and interest. The exigencies of the struggle forced the industrialists to squeeze every possible source of profit tighter, and thus to increase the already cruel oppression of the laborers and their families. The ruling code of honor was now that of the cutthroat, and the economic life of the nations was a vile scramble for profit. Into this scramble there now entered new contestants. First was the proletariat, which now allied itself with the finance capitalist in the attack on the industrialist from above and below. The proletarian conscript was fitted out by his self-chosen non-proletarian leaders with a doctrine, organization, and tactics. The doctrine was that the entire history of the world was nothing but a continual class struggle, with money as its sole end and aim. The fact that this repulsive and grotesque outlook could even be formulated is itself the only commentary necessary on the kind of world liberalism creates. The organization form was the trade union, and the tactic was the strike. All three, the doctrine, the organization, and the tactic, are purely economic, purely materialistic, and capitalistic. Although they proclaimed themselves against capitalism, they thought in its cadre, shared its aim, and fought with its weapons. Instead of manipulating the supply of goods, like the industrialist, or the supply of money, like the finance capitalist, they manipulated the supply of labor. The labor leader now became the third member of the snarling capitalist trinity.